My name is Glyn McKay. I'm the Executive Director of the Club for Growth Foundation. We are the 501c3 arm of the Club for Growth, which you may be familiar with their political work. But my connection here is that I have the privilege of running the foundation, and we have a fellowship program that great Americans like Nick Horton and David Ray and Austin McCollum have participated in. So we run a fellowship program, and then we have another program where we produce economic scorecards. And that is why I am so excited about this conversation this morning. We have done a federal scorecard that publishes the voting records in Congress. We've done that since 2005. And in 2018, we decided to take that to the state level. It's been a very interesting process because what we have discovered is that DC is not the only threat to economic freedom or to the American people's ability to work and produce as they should. So I'm going to go back to my notes. I do this every time because I could just keep talking. So one thing we find is that the states seem to be kind of a copy-paste in a lot of ways of the swamp in Washington. Big spending, crony practices, picking winners and losers in the marketplace, and then of course the regulatory burden that's stifling innovation and productivity. However, Arkansas is really exciting when we look at the data coming out of here. You guys are truly the land of opportunity and home to some of the greatest entrepreneurs that America has seen, like Sam Walton, J.B. Hunt, John Tyson, and so many more. It feels like entrepreneurialism isn't just an idea, it's really in your DNA. So as mentioned this morning, that was a great panel, just thinking about all of the things that you guys have done and all that is to come. There's still more to do. You should be commended for the tax cuts and the ways that you guys are really empowering Arkansans, putting money back in their pockets so that they can produce and innovate and thrive. But for the purpose of this expectations, we are going to cover some of the state government's most anti-business policies. And while we could talk about regulations and licensing and a host of other government burdens, we're going to specifically focus on taxes because of the opportunities for reform that are right in front of you. So we have several experts joining us this morning. Patrick Gleason is the Vice President of State Affairs at Americans for Tax, Washington-based advocacy and policy research organization. He's also a senior fellow at the Beacon Center of Tennessee, a free market think tank based in Nashville. Jay Robertson joined Arkansas this year as the Public Affairs Director. Prior to that, he worked at Prospera as Vice President of Development and previously worked on workforce reform policy at Empower, Mississippi. And finally, Representative David Ray currently serves in the Arkansas House of Representatives, representing Arkansans in the 69th District, and has done so since 2021. He serves on a number of committees, including the House Revenue and Taxation Committee. Gentlemen, Arkansas has truly come so far, and nearly overnight, the state went from having one of the highest marginal tax rates to one of the lowest in the country, unquestionably bringing relief and opportunity to business owners and individuals. So let's focus for a minute on the income tax specifically. What is it about the income tax that is so harmful to economic growth, and why is eliminating it a priority?
So, are we on here? All right. So to use a technical term, all taxes suck, but there are some taxes that suck more than others. And from an economic perspective, when you're talking about the income tax, let me back up. One of the most basic rules of human behavior is if you want more of something, you incentivize it. If you want less of something, you penalize it, right? Anybody who's been a parent knows this is true quite intimately. And when it comes to the income tax, what it penalizes is work and labor and productivity. And these are things that we should all want more of in society, not less. You know, you think about the sales tax. Well, I don't really like paying sales tax either, but what does sales tax punish? Sales tax punishes consumption. Well, we certainly don't want people to consume everything that they earn, right? We want people to save and invest and give to causes they believe in. But a lot of our economy runs on consumption, right? So we need people to consume. And that is why I think the income tax is particularly odious as a tax, is because of what it disincentivizes: work, labor, productivity, all of the things that we want more of in society, not less.
And just to add another point to what Representative Ray was saying in terms of the benefits of income tax relief and rate reducing tax reform, I would highlight some thoughts on two common arguments you folks in here have heard against income tax rate reduction, being a state that has done so much of that in recent years. You hear from a lot of folks when you try to cut, particularly the top rate, oh, it's a giveaway to the rich, it's a tax cut to the rich. We hear that everywhere. We heard that with the same thing with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act federally, even when the facts clearly show it's a tax cut for every income category. One thing I'd point out there is that it's clear that it's not just a tax cut for the rich. As a lot of folks here know, while you're not one of the flat income tax states, you're what we consider kind of an effectively flat state, given your top rate kicks in at such a low level of income. Pretty much everyone is paying the top rate here, so it's effectively flat state. So yes, it doesn't just benefit the rich, as a lot of folks already know. But another point to point out that gets missed by the media and certainly by critics of income tax rate reducing reform is the way in which it benefits small businesses, which are responsible for the lion's share of job creation. And that's because the majority of small businesses file under the individual income tax system. So when you're cutting the top personal income tax rate, while you're getting accused by opponents falsely of saying it's a tax cut for the rich, you're actually reducing the burden on small businesses, thereby increasing their job creating and sustaining capacity. So it's not a tax cut for the rich. You all know it applies to all income levels, but it also is a tax cut for small businesses. So something to keep in mind. And you also, you guys are a state that has been at the forefront of, what I believe is one of the top two policy trends in the nation over the last decade. One is the expansion of school choice, and the other one is income tax rate reduction. You actually have been the forefront of both of them, actually, as it stands. And actually, just this map they couldn't get on the screen, but the colors, what that shows you, the green, those are no income tax states, and the yellow are flat tax states. And what we've seen in the past decade, it's been a massive expansion of flat tax states. We've gone from 9. North Carolina became the 9th when they enacted their tax reform in 2013. We've now gone to 14, and we expect that number to grow. When you consider the number of no income tax states and flat tax states, we're now at almost half the country that hasn't either no income tax, a flat rate of 0 or above. Nearly half the country, and I think we'll get to over half the country in the coming years. So just a couple things I want to point out on that, and also just kind of where you are on that trend and at the forefront of that. So it's exciting to be here in a state that is playing such a leading role on this trend. And I'll just end by pointing out, I ran into your governor at an RGA reception in Milwaukee this summer. And I said to her, I said, Governor, we talk about Arkansas a lot in other states because we point out Arkansas is the only state in the country that enacted 2 income tax rate reductions in 1 calendar year. And before I could even complete the sentence, she added, actually, it was 3 income tax cuts in 2 years. So yeah, I was actually underselling it, but she was quick. She was very aware of that and was quick to point that out. So you guys have a lot to brag about, and just to highlight how we're in this heightened era of state tax competition. I'm based in North Carolina. We had a lower rate than you guys for a while. Ours has come down to 4.5. It'll be a 4.25 in January, but you also have got below us now at 3.9. But the good news is we have revenue triggers that are going to get us down to 2.49 by the end of this decade, which would get us just below Arizona as the lowest flat rate, assuming no one else jumps ahead of us. I wouldn't be surprised, given the leadership you have in this state, both in the legislature and the executive branch. I wouldn't be surprised you guys jump in front of us and beat us to below 2.5. But just highlighting the context and where you all stand at the forefront of this heightened era of state tax competition.
Yeah, so just to add to what David said, we care about income tax reduction because it's literally a tax that punishes work. When we apply excise taxes to things that are detrimental, we acknowledge that adding taxes to something discourages that behavior, and an income tax literally discourages work. And as Patrick mentioned, it's important because Arkansas does not exist in a vacuum. 2 of our states that border Arkansas don't have an income tax. And people have a choice of where to live and where to work. And Arkansas can lead by continuing to reduce the rate and get that to 0 so that we can actually be competitive for good paying jobs that we need here. The other point is that when we reduce taxes, a lot of times the media tries to frame the narrative as we're cutting revenue for the state. And they frame it as a negative, but those dollars don't just evaporate. They go back to taxpayers who invest into their businesses, start a business, spend it in their communities. That money circulates in the economy. And I think it's really easy to fall into that trap of talking about revenue when taxpayers don't care about that. They care about what their paychecks look like. And reducing income taxes effectively gives a pay raise to every single person that's working in Arkansas. And that's why we care about it, and that's why it's so important for entrepreneurs especially.
On the revenue constraint point, I find that one particularly offensive, especially when many states are passing bills to give carve-outs or subsidies, special handouts to special interests or well-connected interests. So I was looking back at our scorecard from 2023 and found 3 bills that were explicit handouts or carve-outs for well-connected interests or corporations, the most egregious being Hollywood. So I would love if you guys would talk a little bit more about how those crony practices are to the detriment of economic growth and especially to individuals, and how reducing the tax burden across the board will benefit all Arkansans.
Yeah, so look, the ideal framework for taxes is as low of a rate as possible that everyone pays the same. And what you're talking about, Glenn, is essentially government putting their thumb on the scale and picking winners and losers. And I've observed legislators love to do this because they love the idea of a certain industry coming to our state or creating jobs in our state. You mentioned film, for example. So then they pick winners and say, oh, we're going to subsidize film companies coming to Arkansas. Well, what is so special about film as opposed to, the 6-hour ammunition manufacturing plant that just opened in Jacksonville to create 700 new jobs there, right? So you really want a policy that is fair across the board for all industries, that doesn't pick winners and losers. And I think it's sort of arrogant for policymakers to pretend that they know best in terms of what industry they want in their state, right? We want Arkansas, we want people to be able to start and grow and expand their business in our state as long as it's legal. There's some things maybe we may want to keep out, but as long as it checks all those boxes, like we want Arkansas to be the home for that. And the more you make special carve-outs, the harder it is. Think of it as if everybody in this room, if we were all eating at a restaurant, and I said, everybody with a blue shirt, you don't have to pay for your dinner. Okay, well that doesn't eliminate the tab. It just transfers the tab to everybody that's not wearing a blue shirt, and they have to pay more as a result. And that's sort of how these carve-outs and credits end up working in practice. It doesn't eliminate the tax liability. It just shoves it on to the rest of the taxpayers.
Yeah, and as David said, the first step to actually working to reduce the income tax is to avoid creating more of these carve-outs, because it just makes it harder for you to do broad-based tax relief. But a more important point that's easy to miss when you're talking about policy is the message it sends to business owners. We heard from a gentleman yesterday who said, I closed down my restaurant. I saw all these incentives being given to new businesses to come into my community, but there was no incentive for my business. And that can be really discouraging for entrepreneurs. So there's a financial impact, but it's also about making sure that we're conveying that Arkansas supports our homegrown entrepreneurs, the people who are already here, and creating those carve-outs is detrimental to them.
Do you have anything to add, Patrick? So let's talk a little bit more. I think that the question that naturally follows is, okay, so revenue constraints. Well, are there opportunities to cut spending? You may not have to cut spending, but I'm of the mind that we should be trying to shrink government. So what ideas, Jay, does Arkansas, or Patrick, have for cutting spending?
Yeah, so first of all, there's two sides to the equation. It's easier to reduce the income tax or taxes broadly when you're spending less money. That's just basic math. And so, we support ideas like spending caps and limiting the growth in spending to ensure that state government is not growing faster than the paychecks of the taxpayers. And so, setting a limit on spending for the state that's tied to a percentage of population growth that's adjusted for inflation would make it easier to support broad-based tax reform into the future. But then all the other policy areas that we've talked about during this event, for instance, Medicaid, the panel discussed this morning, some of the reforms to Medicaid, it's a gigantic piece of the budget. It's a quarter of the state's budget. making changes to that program frees up revenue that allows us to continue on the path of tax reduction. And so you have to take a holistic view and look at where can we cut spending or better prioritize the dollars that we have so that we can return more of those back to the taxpayers.
Yeah, and I would just point out that you don't actually have to drastically cut spending to facilitate significant income tax rate reduction, as opponents of rate reduction will often claim. They'll paint doom and gloom scenarios. What will happen with revenues, aside from falsely claiming it's just for the rich. But if you look at historical spending data, and I would point to a resource, we have atr.org. If you go to that slash budget project, you'll see a map that we've put together. It's a resource, online resource. We've worked with Vance Glyn, former economist at Trump OMB, and also down in, with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We worked with him to build that out. And if you go to the map, you can click on any state, you can click on Arkansas, and you can see how much state spending. We broke it down so you could see everything, total outlays growth, as well as just state funds over the past 10 years, and also how that compares to population growth plus inflation here. And what you see is you certainly see spending has gotten much more under control in recent years. And you all have done a commendable job on that, in addition to playing a leading role in rate reducing tax reform. But what you see is that spending, both total outlays and just state funds, have grown well in excess of population growth plus inflation over the decade, to the point where, if the state funds would have been about $2.9 billion lower in 2023 than they were had spending grown in line with population growth plus inflation. That one-year savings number is even larger when you're looking at total outlays. So the point there is that alone, just more modest rates of growth, not drastic cuts, could free up enough resources to facilitate significant rate reduction. So we highlight that because we think that shows, one, that whether a state is spending sustainably or not. We often get asked a lot, oh, hey, there's a no new taxes pledge, and it's easy to tell whether a politician is raising taxes or not. We have a fiscal note. We should have a no, don't spend too much pledge. Well, the problem with that is why you can't really have that is because there's no binary metric like there is with a tax hike or not, a fiscal note showing whether it goes up or down net impact. And it's very subjective, what is spending too much. In our subjective opinion at ATR, we think population growth plus inflation is a good guiding post to determine whether you are growing at a sustainable clip. Yes, there are thousands, millions of decisions that need to be made that determine whether that trajectory is maintained or adhered to. But we think in just terms of a benchmark, a guiding post, whether we're doing a good job on spending, we think that's a pretty good guiding post. So that's why we created that resource. So I just want to highlight that there. You can see Arkansas as well as surrounding states and all other states. But I think it does highlight you could facilitate a lot of further rate reduction with just more modest rates of spending growth. But I say that to point out, honored to be here because this is a state that has been playing a leading role in the national movement towards lower, flatter rates. So I offer that constructive advice, but with the addendum that you guys are certainly showing other states what sound tax reform looks like.
So Jay and Patrick referenced either statutory or constitutional caps on spending increases, which I think is a good idea because if you are relying on politicians to limit their own spending, you're going to be waiting quite a while. I hate to share that news with you. But the other side to the coin, and Colorado is probably the best example of a state that has effectively done that. But the other side of the coin is that tax cuts themselves are a restraint on new spending, because you got to remember, unlike Washington, D.C., where they just print money out of thin air, Arkansas can't do that. We have to have a balanced budget. And so when we lower taxes, that's less money that's available to spend in the future. And if you look back, to 2021, the beginning of 2021, we've cut about $1.3 billion in income taxes. We have a $6.4 billion general revenue budget, 6.5, and so that's a $1.3 billion that's not being added to our budget now because we've gone in and lowered those taxes. So that's the other side to the coin of constraining spending is, and I say that because the political incentives are not usually very great to cut spending. Anytime you propose cutting a certain program or reducing the funding for a certain program, often the political incentives are not good. People scream and cry and light their hair on fire, and there's lots of wailing and gnashing of teeth. And but when you cut taxes, it's not really always that way. People like getting their taxes lowered. There are political incentives aligned to lower taxes, and so that's the reason I mentioned that.
And I would just add, in a state that's already done a lot on income tax rate reduction, and folks have said in the future, in the out years, you're going to be looking to consider more spending restraint, but particularly revenue triggers, which I mentioned before, is a mechanism we highlight and like a lot at ATR as a way to facilitate rate reduction, because you can ensure you don't, it helps protect against, getting over your skis, biting off more than you can chew, but also designed properly, it can also act as sort of a backdoor spending cap. I think so. We did revenue trigger enabled tax relief both on the corporate side and now on the personal rate in North Carolina. And those revenue triggers, I think, have been a big reason why we've been able to grow voluntarily, not with a restriction like Colorado has, but voluntarily have grown state funds in line with population growth plus inflation, which is why we've had billion-dollar surpluses while we've been enacting billions of dollars in rate reduction. So that's what, spending restraint we think is part of facilitating rate reduction. And I really do highlight revenue triggers as a way to do that because it does act as sort of a backdoor spending cap designed properly.
Which is essentially the answer to my next question. But let's be very explicit. In 2 years, y'all have gone from almost 7% income tax rate to 3.9. So how do you completely eliminate it entirely? What's the plan? The framework that you would propose?
So I think there's three main things that we have to do in order to fully realize this goal. But first, I think it's worth noting that when people first started talking about eliminating the income tax, there were a lot. You would get when you said this around the Capitol, you would get a lot of snickers, especially from the lobbying crowd. You would get sometimes open ridicule. They thought that this they thought this was a talking point. They thought it was a political gimmick, something that people were saying to get votes, things like that. Well, if those people had just gone into a coma 11 years ago when we had a 7% income tax rate and woke up today at 3.9, they would probably look around and be like, holy cow, what happened here, right? So the fact is, it is achievable. It's not an easy goal. There's no state in the country that's ever gone from having an income tax to not having one. That doesn't mean it can't be done, because I'm not sure that any state has really purposefully tried in a concerted way over a long period of time, and that's what it takes. So I tell people that three things have to happen. Number one, as you enact pro-growth economic policies, your economy is going to grow. And as your economy grows, you have to have the fiscal discipline to apply a significant portion of that growth to future rate reductions. And so each time you implement more pro-growth economic policies, your economy is going to grow more. So there's sort of a snowball effect there. And that's what we've done, basically. That's basically what we have done over the last, 11 years, is cut a little bit at a time, and as our economy grows, apply a significant chunk of that savings to cutting more. But I think you could really turbocharge this effort if you did the other two steps. The second step, I think, would be really going after spending in an aggressive way. And there's a lot of different buckets of spending throughout state government, whether it's real estate or vehicle fleet management or employee benefits or shared services. There's all these different things that states spend tons of money on. And if you really do a deep dive into all these little buckets, you can save 20 million here, 30 million here, 50 million here. One of my favorite examples of this is real estate. The state of Tennessee, when former Governor Bill Lee came in, they looked around and they said, boy, the state owns a lot of real estate, and it's really not being managed properly. We got this building over here with 14 floors and only 3 of them are occupied, and then we got this building over. So they created an 11-person department by eliminating positions in other agencies, and they called it STREAM, State of Tennessee Real Estate Asset Management. And after 8 years, they had gone through, they'd moved people into buildings, made better use of their space, they'd done energy efficiency stuff, they quit paying state employees to clean the buildings and outsource that to the white pages, or the yellow pages rather. And And they did all these different things. And over the course of 8 years, they were able to achieve $60 million in annual savings just from real estate. So that's bucket number 2. And then bucket number 3 would be the more politically difficult one to tackle, but that would be closing some of these loopholes and carve-outs and exemptions that we've talked about, especially, on the picking winners and losers side, and really rolling those savings into just accelerating the progress even further. So that would be my blueprint.
And I would just highlight on January of next year, New Hampshire is going to become the 8th true no income tax state. They didn't have a full income tax repeal because they didn't have a wage income tax, but they did have a tax on investment income. That's been phased out. That phased out will complete at the end of this year. So they'll become true no income tax number 8. And Tennessee got that when they phased out their investment income tax. That was completed a few years ago. Sadly, it should have been 9, but Washington implemented a capital gains tax. So we had to sadly take them off the no income tax state board, but still a net gain of 1. So so we see that in New Hampshire next year. But and I think, I'm not in the prediction business, but I'm fairly confident. I think whether it's Arizona or North Carolina or both are poised to become a no income tax state in the next decade, likely in the 2030s. It seems like that 2.5 range where Arizona is at the low flat rate is kind of a good way station before you can get ready to then make the push to 0. And I think David's right, Representative Wright's right. I think it's going in a more gradual approach has proven to be a more successful approach. You just look at North Carolina versus Kansas. Kansas really did, they did a lot of things wrong. Mainly they spent too much, but they kind of went too far too fast also. And North Carolina has been more gradual, significant but gradual, and with the help of revenue triggers, has been more successful. So we'd rather get to the end point, even if it takes a little longer, than try to drive too fast and swerve off a curve, like we've seen in some other places. So yeah, just point that out.
And can I say one more thing on this? I had somebody ask me yesterday, they said, I keep hearing from people that this is just too big of a goal. Like getting to 0 is just too big. Like how could we possibly get there? And I just told them, look, tell your friend that if their mind is just too small to conceive getting to 0, then think about it this way. How do we get from 3.9 to 3.5? And when we get to 3.5, have them picture, how do we get from 3.5 to 3.0? And then just keep repeating this process until it's over with. And I've told people before who've ridiculed this idea of going to 0. I've told them, look, I don't know what you're so mad about. Let's just say that you're right and we fail, and we get to 2%, and we realize, you know what, we just can't get rid of that last 2%. Well, how bad would that suck, right? To end up with a flat 2% tax. No, that would be awesome. We would be the envy of pretty much every other state in America except the 8 that don't have an income tax. So that would be my message to those people.
Well, when you talk about people who say it's too big, you've got about to be 8 states that show how it's done. And those 8 states, you look at the various economic metrics, GDP growth, population growth, et cetera, they all well outperform national averages. So that's something to consider as well. And I also think it's kind of analogous to what J.D. Vance said when he's like, well, how are you going to do mass deportation? He's like, well, it's kind of like eating a big sandwich. I'm going to take one bite, I'm going to take another bite, I'm going to take another bite, kind of similar to what you're saying in terms of chipping away at the income tax.
What are some of the other reforms? I mean, thinking within the tax framework, what are some other reforms that you could implement, some other taxes you could go after that could produce?
I'll just highlight 2 thoughts real quick. One, I want to mention, you guys deserve a commendation for also cutting the corporate tax rate, not neglecting that while you were doing personal income tax rate reduction. And one thing I want to highlight there is just as something as you look to do further corporate rate reduction in terms of the benefits of that and also rebutting some misinformation. You hear from opponents of that a lot. Oh, it's a giveaway to fat cats. It's a giveaway to CEOs, et cetera. Well, that's not the case. And it's not even just conservatives saying that anymore. And one thing I want to highlight with some ammo you have in pushing back against that is you can point to even the Obama administration and even Democrats, left-wing outfits like the Tax Policy Center acknowledge this. Example, 2013, under Obama, the Joint Committee on Taxation in Congress adjusted their methodology to account for the fact that corporate taxes are paid in part by people. So when they score bills, they now factor that in. That was done in Congress. Then the Obama administration made a similar adjustment with their Treasury Department scoring, factoring in for the first time ever in their methodology the share of corporate taxes and the reality that corporate taxes are borne by people. And we actually have seen some effects of that recently, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which when Biden signed that, there was no income tax rate increase in there, but the score still showed it resulted in a tax burden increase, even on the lowest income households as low as $10,000 a year. Why was that? Well, that was because of that methodology change to account for the fact that corporate taxes are borne by people. There was a corporate tax hike in that bill, so it showed even the lowest income households were going to get hit with a higher tax burden. So it's not even just conservatives saying this, even folks on the left, the Obama Treasury Department, Tax Justice Center, the debate is not over if corporate taxes are paid by people and workers, it's the degree to which they're shared by them and shareholders and whatnot. So I just want to highlight that as you look at more corporate rate reduction in the future. And maybe Representative Ray wants to talk to it more. Franchise tax, kind of really dubious tax. That's why so few states have it, only 15. We encourage states to get rid of that if they can. North Carolina, we're chipping away, and that will hopefully have that gone soon. But that's another one. And then maybe you want to talk about it more. But being the only soda tax state seems like a dubious distinction that would do well to get rid of.
Yeah, so in addition to franchise taxes, which actually impact small business, there's also sales tax, registration tax that businesses pay. Arkansas has a state grocery tax. None of these make a lot of headlines because the rates are not enormous, but that also makes it easier to eliminate these and lock in wins. I mean, that's also really important with tax reduction. Whenever we can get rid of a tax completely, makes it very difficult for that to come back. And it puts money back in the pockets of entrepreneurs, and especially with the franchise tax and like these sales tax registration fees, all these little taxes, they may not be huge numbers, but they add to just the compliance burden of people who are in business or starting a business. And a lot of small businesses fail. It's difficult. And each one of those things just places another small hurdle in front of people who are looking to get started.
I think that's good. Did you bring a menu for us?
I'm so glad you asked for a list of taxes you wanted to eliminate. I happen to keep one with me, but I saw we